Operation Metro Surge continues this morning, but with fewer federal agents here in the Twin Cities.
Earlier this month, the Twin Cities became the front line of a major immigration enforcement surge. Federal officials said the mission was simple: find people with outstanding deportation orders, especially those with serious criminal records, and remove them. But what started as a local crackdown is already sending ripples far beyond Minnesota. Because the consequences aren't staying inside one city, one agency, or one headline. This isn't just a story about arrests. It's a story about timelines, paperwork, and systems, and what happens when enforcement collides with politics, protests, and alleged fraud networks that investigators say were never supposed to exist at this scale. When the government wants you to believe something is straightforward, they focus on the headline: a sweep, a crackdown, worst of the worst. But the real story usually lives somewhere else, inside the timeline, and inside the filings. Because the moment an operation moves from press conference language to court records, it becomes something different. A case file, a chain of custody, a trail. And that trail doesn't only show who got arrested, it shows who didn't. It shows who slipped through. And it shows how long certain names, orders, and convictions sat in the same neighborhoods, untouched, until the federal government showed up with a list. In the wake of the surge, new filings began appearing, documents that may shape how this all unfolds months from now. If the operation is the visible part, the paperwork is the connective tissue. And as the language around the surge kept escalating, it started pointing to something larger than individual arrests.
From this 5-bed, 4.5-bath in Washington County, to a $1 million house in Plymouth, complete with an indoor basketball court.
My name is Eric Rasmussen. I'm a reporter with KS. Do you know if the government is trying to take this house? They're not?
We had to see these properties for ourselves. Each house owned by people convicted of fraud, connected to feeding our future. $250 million meant to help kids in need, stolen at the height of the pandemic. Take former Safari restaurant owner Salim Saeed.
5 guilty verdicts now.
A jury convicted him and Feeding Our Future founder Amy Bach nearly 9 months ago.
That line matters, not because it's dramatic, but because it signals a pivot. From isolated enforcement to a broader examination of the systems that allowed certain people to remain on the street. And, investigators allege, allowed money to move through public programs in ways those programs were never built to withstand. Here's where things get bigger than Minnesota. Federal agents in another major city reportedly stormed a high-end property tied to a trafficking investigation, one with alleged international connections and money figures described as massive. Different location, different headlines, but the theme is the same. Coordinated networks aren't confined to one zip code. They spread. And when enforcement ramps up in one place, it can trigger actions and reactions elsewhere. What looks like a local operation can become a national signal. The government is going hunting for networks, not just individuals. And once that happens, the story shifts from who was arrested to what the arrests reveal. According to federal statements, on December 1st, 2025, immigration authorities launched what they called Operation Metro Surge in the Twin Cities. The stated mission: remove criminal illegal aliens who pose a public safety threat. Officials said the operation deployed over 100 specialized officers, pulled in from across the country, aimed at a target list of roughly 500 people with outstanding deportation orders.
Look at Minnesota, where Somalians have taken over the economics of the state and have stolen billions and billions of dollars from Minnesota and indeed from the United States of America. And we're going to put an end to it. For so long as before my election, the vast majority of good and decent Americans were forced to watch as corrupt politicians plundered the halls of power, exploited our taxpayers, and pillaged every system that makes civilized society function. But not anymore, and you see that every day, not anymore. We're putting America first, and we are making America great again. Very simple. We are making America great again.
Within the first 2 weeks, authorities claimed more than 400 arrests, many described as serious offenders, gang-associated individuals, violent offenders, and people with prior convictions. Federal officials also claimed at least one target, described as a person with prior arrests for domestic violence and disorderly conduct, managed to evade arrest. And that's where critics of the system lean in, arguing that the reason the federal government stepped in is because local policy created what they call a revolving door. Because this isn't only enforcement, it's a conflict between jurisdictions over who cooperates, who refuses, and who gets blamed when something goes wrong. In press materials and public commentary surrounding the surge, several individuals were highlighted as examples of why the operation was necessary, described with allegations ranging from gang affiliation to sexual offenses to repeated probation violations. Here's the important thing. The names themselves are less important than what they represent in the narrative. They're used to paint the operation as urgent. If these are the people living among us, the argument goes, why weren't they removed earlier? And that question points back to the system. How do outstanding orders sit for years? How does enforcement get delayed? How does a target list grow to hundreds? Critics say the answer is policy and non-cooperation. Supporters of local limits say the answer is constitutional safeguards and civil rights. Either way, the surge didn't just remove people, it exposed how long unresolved cases had been allowed to remain unresolved. But then, the story took another turn. Because as the arrests made headlines, investigators and commentators kept linking the surge to something else: money. There's a moment in stories like this where everything changes. At first, it's criminals, then it's networks, then it becomes who funded what, and how did the money move? In public commentary and court records tied to major Minnesota fraud cases, prosecutors have described alleged schemes involving fraudulent claims, kickbacks, and organized exploitation of programs designed to help vulnerable people. And that's the pivot. Once you shift from individual wrongdoing to coordinated funding, this becomes a systems case. Because systems don't just fail accidentally, they fail when they're overwhelmed, exploited, or designed with gaps big enough to drive a truck through. Federal investigators have described Minnesota as the site of enormous alleged fraud, figures that have been discussed in the hundreds of millions, even approaching $1 billion across multiple programs and allegations. And in the most explosive claims, still contested and politically charged, some sources have suggested that portions of stolen money may have ended up overseas, potentially reaching extremist-linked networks. That last claim is serious and requires careful, evidence-based scrutiny, but its presence alone shows how high the stakes have become. This isn't being framed as ordinary fraud, it's being framed as national security. Listen to how the numbers stack up, because the scale is part of the story. One case is described as roughly $1 million. Another alleged scheme, child nutrition fraud, has been described in court as over $300 million. As of late 2025, dozens of defendants had been charged in that broader case, with many already convicted or pleading guilty, according to federal reporting and court proceedings. Then comes the next rung of the ladder: programs beyond one single case. One state program, meant to stabilize housing, reportedly expanded far beyond initial budget expectations, followed by provider terminations amid what authorities described as credible fraud allegations. Another alleged case involved billing for services, like autism therapy, while reportedly delivering little to no meaningful treatment, according to enforcement actions and public reporting around raids. These aren't small bookkeeping errors. These are allegations of organized exploitation, systems being used like pipelines. And when the public hears fraud at that scale, the next question is inevitable. How did this happen for so long? This is where the story becomes political. Not because politics is the point, but because policy determines cooperation. Supporters of the surge argue that Minnesota leadership and Twin Cities officials built a framework that limited cooperation with federal removal efforts, prioritizing separation between local policing and immigration enforcement. They point to expansions of benefits and eligibility rules, and to legal opinions that local agencies cite when they refuse compliance with federal detainer requests. On the other side, defenders argue those limits exist to protect constitutional rights, prevent unlawful detention, and preserve trust between immigrant communities and local law enforcement. And that legal argument has a specific hinge: whether honoring certain detainer requests without a judicial warrant constitutes an unreasonable seizure under constitutional protections. That's not a talking point. That's a legal battleground. And when lawsuits enter the picture, state versus federal, city versus agency, the timeline gets even more important, because every filing locks another piece of the story into the record. As the surge continued through December, something else escalated: street-level confrontation. Federal officials claimed their agents faced growing interference during operations: large crowds, blocked exits, chaotic scenes. Local agencies, in some accounts, responded primarily to keep the peace, helping separate groups, facilitating departures, and documenting what they observed. Activists, for their part, argued they were organizing community resistance and training people on how to observe or challenge enforcement activity, framed by supporters as civil disobedience and by critics as obstruction. Federal authorities also claimed assaults against agents rose sharply during this period, a statistic that became a major talking point in the public defense of the surge. And here's the implication. When enforcement becomes a street confrontation, the operational window narrows, risk rises, and every decision gets tested in real time, on sidewalks, not in press rooms. Which leads to the final question. If this was about the worst of the worst, why does it feel like the entire system, law, policy, welfare oversight, enforcement, and public trust, is what's actually on trial? So how did Minnesota become the setting for two narratives at once? A crackdown framed as a public safety necessity, and a fraud crisis framed as systemic exploitation? The uncomfortable answer may be that these stories overlap in one key way. Both depend on enforcement capacity. Both depend on oversight. Both depend on institutions that can move fast enough to stop harm, without breaking the rules meant to protect everyone. And when those institutions fail, or are perceived to fail, people fill the gaps with fear, blame, and politics. That's why the filings matter. That's why the timeline matters. Because the final story won't be written in a speech, it'll be written in court.